think we'll start. I would like to welcome you all to this seminar called The EU and a Changing World, the Global Strategy and its Implementation. So in this seminar, we will learn more about the global strategy that was adopted last year, just after the Brexit referendum. And this is a very important document because it's very different also from the first strategy that was written in 2003. It's more focused, it's more concrete, focusing on how to promote EU's interest in kind of globally. And it also has a program for how it will be implemented. But last year, when it was adopted, the Brexit referendum took almost all of the attention away from the global strategy. And after that, we have had, as you all know, the election of Donald Trump, also different elections in Europe, and that we all have followed closely. And what we all wonder now, of course, is how Brexit, Trump, and last but not least, the election of Emmanuel Macron in France will impact the implementation of this strategy. And to help us to draw light on that, we are very pleased to have Director Antonio Missiroli here. Antonio Missiroli became Director of the EU Institute for Security Studies in 2012. Previously, he was advisor at the Bureau of European Policy Advisors, BEPA, of the European Commission. And he was in charge of European Dialogue, Outreach and Publications. He has also been Director of Studies at the European Policy Center in Brussels, and a research fellow and a senior research fellow at the Institute, the Western European Institute for Security Studies in Paris, which was the predecessor institute of the EU Institute before it became an EU agency. It was part of the Western European Union. And that was also when I first met Antonio as an intern at that institute in 2001. Before I give the floor to you, I will just say that this seminar is part of a seminar series that we have here at NUPI, funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's called Norway Meets Europe. And it's also closely linked to a research project funded by the Research Council called EU Nord. And I will also, for your information, the seminar will be streamed. So Antonio, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone, and it's always a pleasure to be back in Oslo, to be back at NUPI, but I'm particularly pleased that you are here so numerous this morning. Actually, coming to a seminar on a Monday morning, on a grey Monday morning in May at 10 is quite an achievement, so I'm particularly pleased that you could make it. I was here roughly 1 year ago, probably 14 months ago, as a part of the outreach and consultation process for the preparation of the global strategy. So I'm particularly happy to be back here to compare notes with you about what has happened since, in particular since the presentation of the global strategy. What I intend to do this morning is to take a little step back in order to discuss with you how it came about, what are the precedents in that particular respect, to go very, very, very quickly through the main elements of the global strategy. There is a little publications over there that collects all the main documents to that effect. And also, of course, and perhaps primarily to go through what has happened since June 2016, and possibly also try and divine and guess what may happen next. It is very difficult to make any educated guess at this stage on both European and global politics, but it could be interesting to have also your perceptions to that effect. So if we can start with the presentation. I don't particularly like PowerPoint, but I think it is, after all, a useful instrument. That is not a fancy PowerPoint, it's just a few speaking notes that could help you follow my reasoning. As you know, the main precedent for the global strategy was the European Security Strategy that was approved in 2003, and that famously opened with the sentence, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free." That very much was the zeitgeist at that time, the way in which we perceived after the end of the Cold War, and probably also at the height of the unipolar moment, the way in which the world was being shaped. At the same time, it was in the midst of the Iraq conflict, both inside the European Union and across the Atlantic, the first threat assessment that the European Union had ever done until then. And at that time, the main threats that were identified by the strategy, apart from the fact that large-scale aggression, Cold War type, was seen as improbable, was international terrorism already, and Europe was seen already at the end of 2003 as both a target and a base for international terrorism. WMD proliferation, the famous cause célèbre of the Iraq War, regional conflicts, both old, Middle East, and new, the Balkans at that time. State failure was identified also as a major source of threat for the European Union and organized crime, and of course the combination and interplay of all them. Shall I, or will you move to the, it's my, how is it? How does it work? Okay. These were the strategic objectives, and there are a few quotes just to give you an idea. At that time, already the idea was the first line of defense will often be abroad and not close to the European continent, but the European Union was confronted with multifaceted situations. Building security in the neighborhood was seen at that time as the main issue. The Balkans, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, and notably Eastern Europe was absent, because at that time there was no perception or suspicion that that could become a source of insecurity for the enlarged European Union. And the notion of neighborhood popped up for the first time in the security strategy. And the famous slogan of the strategy was that the European Union aimed at international order based on effective multilateralism. And you could find terms like international society that is normally associated with the liberal view of international relations and good governance in the strategy itself. And I'm still stuck with the, what is the button I have to push? This one. Okay. The policy implications for the European Union was to become more active. There is a need to develop a strategic culture that fosters early, rapid, and when necessary, robust intervention, more capable, in particular by pooling and sharing military capabilities, and more coherent in line also with what the treaties were saying to that effect. The security strategy was a big hit, both among academics and across the Atlantic. The Americans in particular received it very well as a paper that differed from some perceptions in the United States, but at least addressed the same issues as the United States, and that was seen as a very possible development for the future. Interestingly, the call that was made at the time for developing action plans and implementing the strategy in practice were not followed by the EU, and probably that had a consequence at some stage. 5 years after that, and you know that 5 years is normally the institutional cycle in the European Union, there was a call coming in particular for the French to review the security strategy, and the review was carried out at the intergovernmental level, whereas the strategy in 2003 had been basically prepared by a small team around Javier Solana, composed in particular Sir Robert Cooper, who was his political director, and Christoph Heusgen, who was the head of the policy unit and is now, as you probably know, the foreign policy advisor to Chancellor Merkel. This second stage in the review of the security strategy was basically a negotiation among the 27 member states, and to some extent it bore the brunt of the process. It was much more difficult to agree on a final text. In terms of content, it was still a relatively interesting document, whereby there was an acknowledgement that the European Union was facing increasingly complex threats and challenges, and also for the first time the recognition that globalization had brought new opportunities, but had also made threats more complex and interconnected. The global challenges and the key threats remains more or less the same, although very often the sinner as compared to the sin a change in the case of WMD. Of course, Iraq was no longer on the table, but rather Iran and North Korea were seen as the main potential threats. Terrorism was seen as homegrown in Europe at that time. We had already suffered the Madrid attacks in 2004 and the London bombing in 2005. Cybersecurity started emerging as a main issue because both Estonia and Georgia during the conflict with Russia had been hit by preventive cyber attacks. Energy security was an issue. You may remember the gas wars of 2007 already. Climate change was defined as a threat multiplier. You may remember that 2004-2005 is the period of the Darfur conflict, and many people conceptualize the Darfur conflict as the first conflict generated by climate change, among other factors. And the notion of state failure started being replaced by the notion of state fragility. If you like, failure is a sort of end state, and there is very little you can do once failure has occurred, and it was normally identified with Somalia. Somalia was a quintessential failed state, at that time, whereas the notion of fragility leaves more margin for policy action, and therefore it was seen as a more operational and dynamic notion that could be used to that effect. And for the first time, piracy and organized crime off the coast of Somalia, off the Horn of Africa, were also seen as threats. Now, after, in particular, the Arab Spring, and even before the big crisis with Russia over Ukraine started emerging, there were recurrent calls for a review or even a rewriting of the European security strategy in light of what had happened until then. And in December 2003, the European Council gave a mandate to the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, who at that time was Catherine Ashton, to prepare to assess the impact of changes in the global environment and to report to the Council in the course of 2015 on the challenges and opportunities arising for the Union. So it is less than a new security strategy. It is less than a global strategy, just a preliminary step. And clearly the timing of the mandate was such that it would not fall onto Catherine Ashton, but on her successor, which would take office at the end of 2014. Catherine Ashton was notoriously reluctant to engage in this particular exercise, but accepted the fact that it was necessary. And therefore there was a sort of relay. The mandate was given to Ashton, but it would be executed by her successor. So the first stage in the so-called strategic review that has been undertaken by the European Union since 2015 was first the report on the global environment in line with the mandate given in December 2013, which we still remember for the 3 Cs, if you like, that the recognition and acknowledgement that the world has become more connected, more contested, and more complex. More connected is quite obvious, for better and for worse. More contested, acknowledging to some extent that the Western narrative, or even the EU narrative, had become more contested in the world, but even inside the European Union, and therefore something had to be done to that effect. And the issue of complexity had become even more apparent over the previous years. There was a sort of geographic scope for the assessment, starting from the European neighbors and moving on to the traditional regions that are the most important ones for the European Union. And there was language about what should be done in terms of orientation for Europeans to that effect. When the report by the HRVP was presented in June 2015, she was given, the new HRVP, Federica Mogherini, was given a mandate for what she insisted would be called a global strategy. Now, the term has given way to some misunderstanding, or probably raised a false expectation to that effect, because it gives the impression that it has a sort of global scope in geographical terms, that the European Union wants to cover the world in terms of security policy in particular, whereas the emphasis was on the French meaning of the term global, that is more joined up by bringing together all the different resources, assets, and instruments that the European Union had. So it was global in a functional rather than in a geographical sense of the term. The drafting process was a sort of hybrid, if you like, between what Solana had done and what was done again in 2008 to that effect, whereby there was initially a sort of outreach and consultation process that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, whereby we held more than 40 events all across the European Union in each and every member state, plus also some non-member states, including Norway, in the first semester from October to April 2016. There was a pen for the strategy, who was not, and is not today, a EU official, contrary to what had happened in 2003. Natalie Tocci is now the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, and she acted as special advisor to the High Representative, and therefore had, if you like, on the one hand, much more freedom than the traditional EU official in drafting the text, but on the other hand, she was much less representative of the EU 28 member states in that particular respect. So there was pros and cons that has to be weighed in the assessment. And alongside Natalie Tocci and the AES, it was the so-called confessionals were organized. Confessional is a term that reminds Catholics of youthful memories, but to some extent the idea was to consult the member states without giving them a veto power on the text. The review in 2008 had failed because one member state could not agree to the formulation that was in the text on NATO, and that member state was Cyprus. and therefore Mogherini didn't want to repeat the kind of experience, didn't want to have a sort of Christmas tree whereby everybody would add a sentence, and adding that sentence would be conditional on the approval on the final text. But of course there was consultation. I mean, the position of the individual member states were taken into account. There were even very funny moments when some delegations were taken to a separate room and were given 2 hours to look into a text without ever being given the electronic version of the text, in order precisely not to have too many versions circulating with too many track changes and so on and so forth. As I said, that was a compromise that worked reasonably well and permitted the High Representative at the end to say that the member states had been involved, but at the same time permitted the member states to say that that was not necessarily a text agreed in the Coreper, and therefore they could take also some distance from the status of the text as such. And the exercise took place in a period of turmoil. As you may remember very well, between 2015 and 2016, the terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels, the migrants crisis hitting the European Union, especially in the autumn of 2015 and the beginning of 2016, and at the beginning of 2016, the announcement by David Cameron that the UK would go for a referendum on EU membership in June. And that, of course, to some extent was felt in the conversation, because at some stage, some member states started questioning the wisdom of carrying out the exercise, when we still didn't know whether the UK, an important player and member of the European Union, would still be in or out at the end of the exercise itself. But nevertheless, the global strategy in the end, as you know, was released 2 days after the Brexit vote. There was uncertainty until the very last minute, because the deal on the eve of the referendum was that the strategy would be presented to the summit and the European Council in the event of a Remain victory, but not in the event of a Leave victory, because that would probably take away the meaning of the whole exercise. And then, single-mindedly, Federica Mogherini decided to present, nevertheless, the strategy, circulated a text that was preceded by a sort of foreword that was much more dramatic about the existential crisis of the European Union, but circulated a text that, after all, she could claim had been discussed at 28 and not at 27. And I have to say, on a personal note, that the UK was one of the most cooperative member states in the confessionals. So there was no obstruction whatsoever on the part of the Foreign Office in the preparation of the global strategy. The approach was extremely constructive, and therefore it did make sense to have a text in the end that was there. The paradox is that precisely because of the nature of the process, precisely because of the political context in late June 2016, the text as such was not approved by the European Council, but the European Council welcomed the presentation, not even the text, but only the presentation, because the procedures for approving a text to that effect would have implied, yet again, going through the Coreper and going through a negotiated text among the 28 member states, which was precisely what Mogherini didn't want to do. I will summarize very, very briefly the main elements in the global strategy. The title is A Stronger Europe, and of course there is at the very beginning a sort of distancing from the optimism of 2003. I mean, of course, the opening sentence of the Security Studies in 2003 was not to be represented in 2016. A stronger Europe is what our citizens deserve and what the wider world expects. Times of existential crisis, so the tone, the mood is completely different as compared to 2003. Our European project, which has brought unprecedented peace, prosperity and democracy, is being questioned. And that was not just Brexit, but at that time we already had a sense that populist forces were emerging and threatening the project from inside the European Union. There is a return to the language of the strategic assessment. We will navigate this difficult, more connected, more contested, and more complex world, guided by our shared interests, principles, and priorities. And here you will have the main emphasis of the text. Our interests and values go hand in hand. We have an interest in promoting our values in the world. At the same time, our fundamental values are embedded in our interests. It is a clever formulation, but of course we should not ignore the fact that the values, both the values on which the EU is based and the values on which external action of the European Union is based, are in the treaty, but the interests are not. If you read the EU treaties, there is no definition of the common interests of the European Union. Now, common interests are based on values, but can also vary a little bit, may have to be adapted to specific circumstances and contingencies, to specific geographic areas. And therefore, the effort in the global strategy was precisely to bridge this gap between the value up there and the specific circumstances in which they had to be translated into foreign policy action. Peace, security, prosperity, democracy, and the rules-based global order are the vital interests underpinning our international external action. The sort of slogan that has become to characterize the global strategy is principle pragmatism. And I can tell you in the confessionals there were many, many discussions on the term. There were some countries that were a little bit ill at ease with that definition. But of course it emphasizes the fact that our principles remain, but we have to be a little bit more capable of adapting to changing circumstances, to the fact there are emerging powers, that we may not have the resources to have the ambitious foreign policy agenda that we framed in 2003. It is, if you like, a recognition of a changing world in that particular respect, also of a changing Europe, but without giving up entirely on the principles and the values the European Union is based on. There is an attempt to bring all member states together by saying there is no clash between national and European interest. And of course, the emphasis on l'union fait la force, that is that we can better defend our shared interests only if we act together and stand together. It emphasizes the principle of engaging in crisis. There is this famous sentence on you cannot pull up a drawbridge to ward off external threats, which is clearly a hint at the migrants crisis, but not only. It is not only related to that. The principle of responsibility is also emphasized, if you like, in the famous opposition between an ethics of responsibility and an ethics of testimony. There is an emphasis on the ethics of responsibility, whereby whereas there is no magic wand to solve crises and there are no neat recipes, nevertheless we have to engage with the wider world, and there is a strong emphasis on the notion of partnership, whereby we cannot do things alone, but we need to have specific partners for each specific contingency, not just international organization, but also regional bodies, states, and you will see also at the sub-state level the importance of having adequate partnerships. The priorities are formulated as the security of our union. Famously, the term resilience pops in the strategy, and it's now probably all over the place, and you will find there will be soon a communication to that effect. The notion of an integrated approach, that is what the global strategy is all about, is articulated in the text, integrated approach to conflicts and crisis, whereby you bring together all the different instruments and elements, the need for cooperative regional orders worldwide, and a new form of global governance for the 21st century. It doesn't simply try to replicate, if you like, the golden age of the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, when international organizations were created. All the international organizations were in a sort of golden age, and including the Security Council, but that is something that cannot simply be replicated. There must be a modernization of the way in which global governance is organized. The emphasis on security and defense, because after all this was seen as a sort of follow-up to a security strategy, was articulated as follows. An appropriate level of ambition and strategic autonomy is important for Europe's ability to foster peace and safeguard security within and beyond its border. So what is new here is the notion of strategic autonomy, although, as you can see, it's a qualified notion of strategic autonomy, an appropriate level, not strategic autonomy in general, an absolute form of strategic autonomy. Probably not even the United States has full strategic autonomy. But there is this emphasis on beyond the borders, but also within the borders. So security is seen as both internal and external. And the formulation whereby Europeans must be able to protect Europe, to protect Europe. It doesn't mean to defend Europe. That is for NATO. But to protect Europe is something that falls into the responsibilities and the competencies of the European Union as we know it. Respond to external crises, and assist in developing our partners' security and defense capacities. That is in part related to the notion of building resilience elsewhere, outside the European Union. Yet again, security and resilience very, very closely associated. The emphasis, yet again, on counter-terrorism, cybersecurity, energy security, and strategic communication. There's just a short paragraph in the strategy on strategic communication about what has happened since has only corroborated the need to operate more actively in that particular respect, both outside in third countries, say the Balkans, and being able to counter other narratives that are being pushed in there, but also inside our own countries, the need to counter certain narratives that are being promoted inside the European Union, and they became particularly important in countries like France and Germany over the past few months, the risk of a sort of misinformation or disinformation campaign that could affect the electoral campaigns and the politics of EU countries. Building resilience in circles, if you like, geographic circles, starting with countries that are candidates for joining the European Union, then the notion of neighbors and the surrounding regions. Some people like to talk of the neighbors of the neighbors. I personally don't particularly like that notion, but the idea is that even our immediate neighbors are part of a broader geographic area that has to be taken into account, because, yet again, the world is much more connected in that particular respect. And of course, there is also a hint at a more effective migration policy for the European Union. These are the cooperative orders. There is nothing particularly new in all this. Closer Atlantic, connected Asia, cooperative Arctic may be interesting for you. That in the confessional was brought up, as you can easily imagine, by the Nordic EU members inside the European Union, and a lot of emphasis on how global governance could be modernized for the 21st century. I invite you to have a look at the text. Finally, in the concluding chapters, there is this idea of mobilizing our networks to mobilize our economic weight and all the tools at our disposal in a coordinated and coherent way. And to fulfill our goals, we must collectively invest in, yet again, you know, the triad, a credible, responsive, and joined up. You remember the more active, more capable, and more coherent. Now it is credible, responsive, and joined up. Federica Mogherini also invited the EU to revise the existing strategies in light of the new doctrinal approach, to devise new thematic and geographic ones. More or less at that time, there was a new strategy on China that was approved by the European Union, and also to carry out a sort of annual review of the state of play of the global strategy. So the review would not be every 5 years, but every year, whereas a strategic reflection should be taken up periodically. Probably every term of institutions and HRVPs, there should be a strategic reflection. Now, the main novelties in the global strategy, to summarize also in terms of language and buzzwords, the emphasis on common interest and not just values, the emphasis on principled pragmatism and not just conditionality and norms, but the emphasis also on pragmatism, the notion of strategic autonomy, albeit qualified and appropriate level of strategic autonomy, the emphasis on state and societal resilience, so both at the state level and the societal level, the emphasis on neighbors and not neighborhood, which is also telling of a policy review that was being carried out on the ENP, the European Neighbourhood Policy. The implication being there is no such thing as a single neighbourhood of the European Union. There are many neighbours and not a single neighbourhood, and therefore policy has to be adapted to and tailored to the different situations we are confronted with in our neighbouring countries and regions. The notion of an effective global governance and not just multilateralism. The recognition behind that being that sometimes also other formats that are not immediately multilateral could serve the purpose of solving crisis and reducing conflict. I understood that also as hinting to the experience made with the negotiations with Iran on the nuclear program. That was certainly not a multilateral process in the first place. It was a minilateral process in many respects, but then was translated into a UN Security Council resolution. But there are also other experiences and cases at the regional and sub-regional level whereby minilateral arrangements have served the purpose of peace better than insisting on having only the multilateral framework in the first place. And also the emphasis on partnering and not just the existing partnerships. You have to find partners and not just work on the existing formalized partnership. As you know, the EU has 10 strategic partnerships worldwide with all the main players worldwide, but they are, or have become rather, more recently quite empty shells in that particular aspect, and therefore there's a need also to revive that kind of approach to international relations, and the emphasis on an integrated and not just a comprehensive approach to conflicts and crises, going beyond CSDP as such, security and defense policy, and embracing a wider spectrum of policies. But the big dilemma at that time for Federica Mogherini was how to move from what was a political document that was her own document by the HRVP and welcomed as a presentation by the heads of state and government to collective policy commitments. And that is where she invented, to some extent, the implementation process. The one process that was not done, was not carried out in 2003. You remember the action plans that were not put in place. So the institutional machinery of the European Union over the past few months, despite Brexit and later on despite Trump, has been heavily engaged in the exercise of the implementation of the global strategy. So although the global strategy per se is not a legal document, is not a binding document for the member states, the implementation process with all the deliberation that have been taken already in the autumn on defense and are likely to be taken again now, is much more binding. So it translates into documents and deliberation that are binding for the member states. There are a lot of acronyms there, so allow me 5 minutes to explain a little more in detail what is in there, but you know a slide that doesn't permit to elaborate too much on that. This is the Security and Defense Implementation Plan on the global strategy. And what it is producing so far, and it is also a matter of days. As we speak, the foreign ministers of the EU are meeting to discuss some details of this plan, and there will be a defense minister meeting on Thursday to confirm what is going to be deliberated today. There are different elements to that effect. One is this sort of obscure acronym that you find there. It is MPCC, which stands for Military Planning and Conduct Capability. In plain language, it is the closest thing to a small operational headquarters inside the EU for military operations. It has a lot of limitations. It is for non-executive military operations, that is operations that are only of an advisory nature. They tend to be advisory missions to the host country. Currently, we have 3 such missions. One is in Somalia, one is in Mali, and one is in the Central African Republic. These are advisory missions, but they are of a military nature. There are soldiers involved in that in order to advise and train local forces to that effect. And the idea is to create a sort of missing link that has been missing so far, having someone in Brussels, in the military staff in Brussels, in the External Action Service, that could liaise between the theater, where the operation is being carried out, and the authorities in Brussels, including the ministers and the Political and Security Committee. It is both a technical and a political issue, as you can easily imagine. Technical because there is actually a need on the operational side to have this kind of missing link in order also to free up the commander of the operational theater from the duty to report back regularly to Brussels and therefore to leave the operation on the ground. But it's also a political issue because symbolically it is the first permanent military structure on the operational side that will be created inside the European Union. So all the language, all the disputes of the past decades over duplicating NATO have come back to haunt the European Union. And although the MPCC, which mirrors a civilian planning and conduct capability, civilian, CPCC, that already exists and has been operational for a long time, is still a little bit contested inside the European Union. You may not be surprised to hear that today there still is a British reservation on the establishment of the MPCC, although what we are talking about is a very, very simple structure that is assembling units that were already in the AES with the addition of some 10 seconded national experts from the member states, and by double-hatting the current head of the military staff, who is a Finnish general, with the role of commander or director of the MPCC. There has been even a dispute on the name of the person who will be in charge of the MPCC, because some people argue that it should be called director in order to emphasize the administrative nature of the job, and other people say, well, if it is a general, a 3-star general, it should be a commander. But if you call it a commander, you risk duplicating NATO, and so on and so forth. These are the disputes we are still confronted with, but my personal hunch is that perhaps not now, not necessarily this week, but certainly after the British elections in early June, that will be approved and become a reality. CARD means Comprehensive Annual Review on Defense, Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, and it is the closest thing that is being proposed to what the European semester is for budgetary policy, for fiscal policies inside the European Union. You know that every year there is a sort of semester in which the Commission, in that particular case, reviews the budgetary plans of all the member states, in particular in the Eurozone, to see how compatible they are with the commitments that the member states have taken. It is a sort of review from the top with the Commission in charge. This is certainly not the case with what is being proposed here, but the logic is more or less to coordinate the planning processes of the member states, to coordinate them among the member states, but also with NATO, the NATO planning process to that effect. Yet again, it has been discussed for quite a while. The idea is that this autumn we start on a sort of trial basis for a couple of years, and to see how it develops over the next years. Of course, it is not binding. It's not going to produce, contrary to the European semester, for fiscal policies, some sort of binding recommendations for the member states, but it's the first time the member states will have to report on their plans and to compare notes among themselves under the coordination of the European Defence Agency. Last but not least, PESCO, which is another Brussels acronym that stands for Permanent Structural Cooperation. It is an article in the treaty. It is Article 46 in the Lisbon Treaty. There is a protocol attached to that that gives all the details about PESCO, and it is an attempt to somewhat replicate the experience of enhanced cooperation. That is something that is carried out only by some member states, but with the sort of deliberation taken by all by qualified majority voting. We do have cases already of enhanced cooperation in the European Union, in particular in the field of justice and home affairs, and it is probably the area in which it is going to be developed most. But if you like, even monetary union is a form of enhanced cooperation, whereby only some member states, on the basis on specific commitments agreed by all, on the basis of a treaty, have pursued the Eurozone integration, and also built an ad hoc institution for that, to that end, that is the European Central Bank. The idea is to try and replicate something similar, although, of course, at a lower level and with lower ambition in the field of defense, whereby some member states, willing and able, would bring together their capacities at the operational level in R&D and also in the field of defense industrial projects, in order to build a sort of core Europe that would be able to generate economies of scale, politics of scale, and also eventually benefit NATO by having a much better output in that particular field. It is still being discussed. There is a strong push, in particular from France and Germany. My personal hunch, yet again, for what it is worth, is that it may materialize, but not right away. Probably it will have to wait until the end of this year and the electoral season in Europe in order to be put on the table, but there are many, many ideas that are being discussed in detail at the intergovernmental level to this effect. We can come back to that in the Q&A session. The Commission itself has produced a European Defence Action Plan, its first ever Defence Action Plan, and launched the idea of a European Defence Fund. It's not the European Development Fund, it's the European Defence Fund, although it may lead to some confusion to that effect. And the idea for the first time is that the Commission is ready to put money into the pot of defense capabilities and military capabilities, which is, if you like, a revolution, knowing the way in which the Commission has operated until recently. Plans are still in the making. There is still very little that is being translated into action, but for instance, in the field of defense research, there is already a preparatory action, there is already money budgeted until 2020 to that effect, with the prospect of going beyond that. We are talking about research and technology and research and development, and some details still have to be sorted out, but there is already a pot that is meant to encourage defense industrial cooperation among the member states. On the 7th of June, you will see a joint communication on resilience prepared jointly by the Commission and the External Action Service on the way in which resilience, building resilience, strengthening resilience, both inside the EU and externally, has to be prepared. I confess I had a look at the first draft that is now under inter-service consultation inside the institutions, and it is basically a set of guidelines. You will not find specific targets to that effect. It is a way of translating a vision precisely into future action to that effect. And there is also a lot of emphasis in all the different council bodies on how to fight terrorism together better, also in the field of sharing intelligence, improving our common migration policy. That is a difficult one. Energy policy, we have already seen a lot of progress in that field, and of course the events of the past 48 hours only emphasize the need to cooperate much more on cyber, and so-called hybrid threats that go under the general category of hybrid threats, and there is a lot of language also on that. My final slide is about what may or may not happen next. It is still very, very difficult to assess what Brexit could bring, and there is also limited freedom for me to discuss, as you can easily imagine, what that could be, but I think it's legitimate to speculate about what impact that could have. Yet again, even when it comes to the impact of the Trump presidency in the United States, it's still very early to tell what the impact could be, but certainly the combination of the two has had an impact in internal discussion inside the European Union, whereby sort of more continental Carolingian approach is starting to take shape, and we'll see whether that will be something that can be agreeable at 27 in the future. Turkey represents a major unknown at this stage. It is something that has been having a huge impact on European discussions so far, but also on our regional security, coming in particular from the Syrian conflict and the migrant crisis that followed. But as you know all too well, some important member states of the European Union have a significant Turkish population, and they are also voters, be it in the Netherlands or in Germany, and therefore it is something that also affects to some extent our polities. Among the dynamic factors, I would have to acknowledge that the President of the Commission has been key in pushing the defense package inside the Commission. The Commission had long been very reluctant to engage in that field, and personally Juncker has engaged and also put pressure on the legal service of the Commission to be much more flexible when it comes to using EU money to that effect. And Federica Mogherini has spent all her energy, despite the impossible job, to push all these envelopes through the Council meetings and formation. But of course all this depends in large part on the electoral cycle that is currently underway in the European Union. I think, we are based in Paris, as you know, and we drew a big sigh of relief last Sunday, not yesterday, but the Sunday before. But it is not over yet. As you know, there are still elections in Germany, although German voters are notoriously predictable and reliable to that effect, and what has happened yesterday in North Rhine-Westphalia seems to hint at a degree of continuity that you haven't had in other European countries. The elections in the Netherlands went better than we expected in that particular respect, but we still have the UK elections on the 8th of June, the parliamentary elections in France shortly afterwards, Austrian elections, that is another development of the past few days, and Austria, as you may remember, is another country where the populist forces are quite strong and solid, and even my own country may go to the polls in the autumn at some stage after Germany. So I think that at the end of this long electoral cycle, we may have more certainties one way or the other, and we could still have in 2018 a year in which, without major elections anywhere, perhaps the dust will have settled in Washington. Perhaps the negotiation of a Brexit will have a much clearer perspective to that effect, and we may be able to use the last year in the institutional and legislative cycle to translate really all these visions into actions. The only thing I would like to emphasize at this stage is, just like Pernille, I have been in this business for 15, 20 years. The ideas we are discussing are not new. What is new is the fact that they are being translated into practice. The idea of a military headquarters, the idea of more defense cooperation and using EU funding for this, the idea of enhanced cooperation on defense, these things have been around for 20 years. But this is the first time in which the conversation has become much more concrete. So since I am also paid to be optimistic, I hope that this will actually happen more concretely in the months to come. Thank you so much, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Antonio, for a very interesting overview of the global strategy and it's how the process will be now with the implementation. I just start with one question while you're signing up with your questions. What about the third countries? Do you think that the implementation of this global strategy will change anything when it comes, and also Brexit, it will change anything with the EU's relationship with the third countries. Of course, we are interested in that in Norway. Norway participates, as you know, very closely to many of the, also in the security and defense area. So
well, I think
you can start with that, and then you can sign. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, just
right away? Or?
Yeah, you can start right away.
I think the European Union would hope that all third countries were like Norway, of course, in many respects. And the emphasis on partnering only makes it clear that the intent is not to act alone, not at all, but also to build a consensus and to build coalitions to achieve goals. And I think there is a lot of language in the global strategy that hints at the need to create coalitions also for peace that are absolutely necessary to that effect. The emphasis is also on mediation and also the need to have external partners in order to strengthen the legitimacy and the effectiveness of whatever action the European Union is taking. I was part of the preparation, for instance, of the preparatory action on defense research, and Norway is the only country that is mentioned outside the European Union there as having access to the funding and everything else. So I think there is a preliminarily very open attitude vis-à-vis Norway in particular. In other cases, I think it will be discussed more on a case-by-case basis, and of course the Brexit thing is still very much an unknown at this stage. I would say that perhaps after the elections in the UK and after the initial stages in the negotiation, we'll have a clearer picture of the extent to which the UK wants to remain in, and for how long. As you may remember, in the letter that Theresa May sent to Tusk to open the process and to trigger Article 50, there was language in particular about security, in which the Prime Minister emphasized how could I put it, the assets that the UK has and the European Union may need to that effect. Personally speaking, I would say that the degree of integration and dependence is mutual and is not just a one-way street. I remember during the referendum campaign in the UK, many security experts, British security experts, saying if we pull out, we will be deprived of very important sources of information for ourselves. So it is not a one-way street. It is, and I think that reason will prevail in this particular respect. Exactly how this will be translated into institutional arrangements is still very unclear to me. But I suppose that it's not impossible for the UK to still participate in certain joint ventures and also to contribute to some budgets, including the EDA budget, the European Defence Agency. The UK is already involved in multi-annual projects to this effect. I cannot imagine them pulling out of those precisely because of all the stakes that are involved in that.
One question over here first.
Yes, thank you for a very nice. Thank you for a very nice review of the questions you are involved in now. The idea of European unity is, of course, very different from sector to sector. We have been surprised to see how unified the EU 27 were when it came to setting up a negotiation plan with Brexit. And when we move to migration, we see the opposite kind of picture where there is hardly any agreement on how to deal with the pressures from outside. You had on the internal-external nexus, you listed 6 or 7 areas. Is it possible for you to give us an idea of how the European unity sits on those different elements? To get an idea of how far away or close we are to specific kinds of policies in these different areas.
I'll try this one. What I can say is that in the area of counterterrorism, cooperation has improved spectacularly since the failures of 2015, 2016. However you see it, and taking into account the unpredictability of the attacks, in particular cooperation between, say, France and Belgium was lacking at that time. And it was all the more telling because the two countries are not only neighbors but share a common language. And nevertheless, the flow of information about suspects and the movement of people was lacking. In this particular field, cooperation across borders has improved enormously, and all the agencies, including Europol, involved in that has increased their profile. there is still a reluctance on the part of the member states, as you can easily imagine, to give more legal competences to supranational bodies and agencies to this effect, but cooperation in practice has improved enormously. And I would say that the types of terrorist attacks that you have seen since are of a kind that is really very, very difficult to predict. And still there has been a claim that many have been prevented as well. Now the dilemma, if you like, in that particular field is that you cannot claim success, because by claiming success, you raise the fear among population that terrorist attack had been attempted. And therefore, you will never have the full picture to that effect. But information, reliable information from insiders says that there have been a lot of success stories in preventing terrorist attacks over the past. And when it is about lone wolves, as you can imagine, that is particularly difficult to prevent and even to spot to that effect. On migration, of course, when it comes to welcoming migrants, differences are still out there. The famous decision by proposed by the Commission in the summer of 2015 to allocate quotas is still largely not implemented by a large majority of member states, to the extent that proposals are being floated on the possibility of putting extra incentives or penalties for this. Incentives for those who comply and penalties for those who don't. But as you can easily imagine, this is very sensitive in political domestic terms. And as long as the migrants are used for populist purposes, that this is a radioactive ground domestically. So I think that, yet again, once the electoral cycle is gone and behind us, hopefully without disasters happening, I think there will be a possibility to have a serious conversation about that. Depends very much on leadership. You need to have leaders who are capable of articulating a positive message and not just a defensive message. Angela Merkel tried in 2015, but then had to retreat a little bit for, yet again, domestic political reasons. The hope is that the new French president will articulate a more future-oriented agenda to this effect, but it is very, very sensitive stuff. And with the Front National at around 30%, of course, that is something that has to be taken into account in a number of member states. On cyber, there has been marginal progress, incremental progress. The European Union, the different Commission agencies have set up a sort of hybrid fusion cell that operates in close cooperation with the NATO hybrid fusion cell. But of course, there are elements there that are not under governmental control, even at the national level. As you know all too well, this is a typical case of private-public partnerships. Symantec knows more about these things than DG Connect in the European Commission, and it is something in which we are constantly behind development out there. But yet again, for instance, as far as the dark web is concerned, there is much more action on the part of EU bodies to that effect. Climate, I think we achieved a success in COP21 in Paris, and now we are just worried that the United States may decide to pull out or not to comply or circumvent the rules. But my understanding is that there is a willingness to adopt a flexible interpretation of the way in which the United States may stay in order to just buy time and hope that at some stage the immediate impact of the Trump presidency may wane and more reasonable approaches may be taken across the Atlantic. I don't know whether this responds to your questions. Some of them are a little bit beyond my portfolio, my field of expertise.
Few more questions. Start with Indra.
Hi, my name is Indra Øvland. I'm a researcher here. And I want to ask, how do you think these developments will affect the will and ability of the EU to maintain sanctions against Russia over Ukraine?
As you know, there have been a number of member states who have tried over the past year or so to put into question the maintenance of the sanctions. Then what Russia did in Syria, to some extent, put that rumors on ice for some time. And when Trump was elected, there was a concern that Trump would act as a sort of disruptive force in this very, very precarious balance inside the European Union on keeping the sanctions as they are. Because there is a balance whereby nobody really wants to break the consensus that exists. And there is sort of inertia whereby unless something spectacular happens one way or the other, we keep things as they are. So I suspect that Trump could be a disruptive force. As you may remember, the first 10 days after inauguration were highly uncertain to that effect. There were rumors that the Trump presidency was ready to lift the sanctions unilaterally. And as you know, the US sanctions are key. The US sanctions are key also for companies in Norway and the European Union, because it is for fear of sanctions penalties coming from the US Treasury that certain deals are not even being attempted at this stage. And therefore that is probably going to be still the decisive factor in all this, considering in particular all the rumors and all the uncertainties that linger over the Trump presidency and its relations with Russia during the campaign, after the campaign, and so forth. This is not going to disappear anytime soon. My understanding is that in the European Union there is an effort by the Commission in particular to keep a balanced approach to all these issues, including energy policy. There is a story about Gazprom, as you know, and there is a deal that is being discussed to that effect. There are a few countries that are very, very willing to overcome the sanctions, but as you know all too well, there are two waves of sanctions against Russia on the part of the European Union. There are the sanctions that were agreed after the annexation of Crimea, light, mostly symbolic. These are unlikely to be ever lifted, precisely because the reason for the sanctions is not going to disappear. I mean, I don't think that there will be any backtracking on that. And then there is a second wave of sanctions, much more substantial, following the MH17 disaster, the downing of the Malaysian Airlines flight over Ukraine. Those are much more substantial, and they depend to some extent on the future of Minsk II. But Minsk II is a metaphor for a deal that may never materialize in full, and therefore that again leaves room for interpretation. There are a few member states, including my own, I have to say, who are pushing for lifting at least part of the second wave of sanctions, but nobody wants to go as far as to break the unanimity at this stage. So only external factors, in my view, will shape this decision. And at this stage, it is impossible to predict what these external factors could be like, be it in Washington or elsewhere. I suspect that if at some stage some deal is made with over Syria, which is not completely unlikely, I think by the end of the year, at least in terms of a ceasefire and some sort of arrangements, the call for lifting the sanctions against Russia could re-emerge.
Thank you very much for a very interesting intervention, Antonio. My question regards one of the things you mentioned in your presentation, namely PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation. And I see that some analysts in Brussels and elsewhere state that PESCO might become the framework for defense integration in Europe now. And I would very much like to hear your view on this. Especially regards if you relate PESCO also to the EDAP and to the defense fund, which you also mentioned. So please elaborate a little bit about this PESCO and what France and Germany will do on this issue, because after the Brexit, the French and the German ministries of foreign affairs and defense ministries also put forward two position papers on this in this regard. So that is my question.
Yes. If you're familiar with the treaty article said that the countries that meet certain criteria can go into permanent structured cooperation mode. They can do that by qualified majority voting, so unanimity is not required. But of course, you need to build a qualified majority to that effect, and therefore you have to be inclusive, at least in the policy approach to how you are going to build permanent structured cooperation. There is a joint Franco-German paper. Our take is that France and Germany still have a slightly different view of what PESCO could be like. The French approach is still predominantly focused on operational issues. So having a permanent structure cooperation on operations, military operations worldwide, be it equipment, be it the costs of missions, and so forth. Whereas Germany has a more, it's a wider approach to that, and wants to include also an industrial dimension to that in particular. Whether these two approaches will at some stage converge is still too early to tell, but the signs now are promising. They were not 3 months ago, but now they are more promising after the election of Macron. Let's see how the parliamentary elections go, but I suspect that there will be a sort of dynamics if Merkel is confirmed and the Grand Coalition is confirmed in Germany and Macron gets some sort of parliamentary majority. This is likely to be high on the agenda. Countries like Italy, Spain, and the Benelux countries are all on board, but a few details have to be clarified. The treaty article is very generic. It's very, it's not as detailed as monetary union was in the treaty to that effect. There are no deadlines, there are no targets, no policy targets, nothing. And therefore, before triggering permanent structural cooperation, it will be necessary to do some preparatory work on what is implied. And that is where all the other things that you mentioned could come into play. Some people think that the only way of making sense of PESCO is to put some incentives into that, because otherwise industrial cooperation, operational cooperation could occur without PESCO. It already happens to some extent, albeit on a small scale. Therefore, the idea is to put both institutional incentives, such as offering a legal status for PESCO, creating a secretariat for PESCO, and the Commission could free up resources to that effect. But the other one, and perhaps most important one, is money. So there could be direct funding for PESCO activities, in particular equipment, training, headquarters, and things like that. There could be other forms of fiscal incentives, such as VAT exemptions for projects that fall under the umbrella of PESCO. And my own country pushes also for discounts on the way in which state expenditure is calculated in the Eurozone. That if the logic is if we invest on defense in the PESCO framework, those investments will not be counted as public expenditure, and therefore it will be easier for a country like Italy to meet the targets that the Commission has put on the country for fiscal policy to that effect. All these things at some stage could converge, and therefore instead of having this fragmentation, if you like, of different initiatives, the Commission is doing something here, the Council is doing something here, some member states are doing something there, you could have a sort of convergence whereby that becomes a serious effort. That will require some time still. I think that pushing a decision on PESCO or on triggering Article 46, so to speak, is a little bit premature, precisely because some elements still have to be discussed. But if I can be honest with you, we have to be optimistic, that could be a game changer, whereby for the first time you have something that is going to benefit both the European Union and, in perspective, NATO, because of virtually all the countries we are talking about are also NATO members. One key point will be how to bring the Central Europeans on board, because for the time being, all the countries that I mentioned are all Western Europeans. And of course, they are concerned about NATO, they are concerned about Trump, they are concerned about Russia. So there must be an opening move that brings, in particular, a country like Poland on board. And my personal take, for what it is worth, is that this opening move could be about upgrading infrastructure. That part of the basket of PESCO could be massive investment of upgrading infrastructure in terms of mobility, harbors, and airports, especially in Central Eastern Europe. I mean, Baltic states, Poland, and so on and so forth. That would meet also NATO demand, because, as you know, there was a NATO report last summer whereby if NATO forces had to be moved very swiftly to the eastern border of the alliance in order to face up to some sort of threat coming from there, we would have trouble. It would be very slow, be it by rail or by plane. And therefore, upgrading that infrastructure could be a win-win situation, and a proposal could bring the Poles on board. And I think that could be part of the trade-off that could generate a qualified majority, because otherwise you don't have it at this stage.
One question related to that, because now I followed the French election campaign, and there hasn't been so much focus on European defense and how to solve kind of, when talking about European integration, it has been how to solve the economic crisis, how to manage to have Germany on a compromise when it comes to changes in the Eurozone. And I just wonder if that might postpone these initiatives on the PESCO, because it will be so important for the EU and for France to succeed in the economic area, and maybe it will be too much to focus on both things at the same time.
Well, you are entirely right that European defense was not part of the broad electoral campaign. Only Macron mentioned that as part of his platform. And of course, in the runoff, Le Pen had a completely opposite platform, and therefore the issue of European defense was not even brought to the voters to that effect. But in the first statements made by Macron after his election, he mentioned that as an area. Now, if I'm speaking under Christophe control, but if I can be honest about this, France has always had a sort of ambivalent attitude vis-à-vis these things, because anything that would reinforce the ability of France to act within a European framework is welcome. Anything that would constrain France inside the European framework is not welcome. And therefore, you mentioned defense integration. The term integration is very sensitive in France. They always talk about la construction européenne, never l'intégration européenne. So you build something with a strong voluntaristic approach, and you do it on a cooperative basis, preferably between France and Germany, with others associated to that. Insofar as Germany has an approach that is much more oriented towards integration, which also means integration of decision-making over industrial projects, deployment, and so on and so forth, equipment, and so on and so forth, France still has a sort of very cautious attitude. And I think that has to be the trade-off. At some stage, if PESCO will ever fly, it will be because there has been a trade-off on these elements. My own country is more on the German side in this particular respect, for a number of reasons that are also related to vested interest in the defense industry. And I think that if France is true, especially Macron is true to his promises, this could be an important, not low-hanging, but an important fruit that he could already harvest before the end of the year or in the first year of his presidency. I think it would be very, because the other fruits on the Eurozone and monetary union will take longer to be harvested, whereas this one could be launched relatively quickly after the electoral season.
Okay, then we have Karsten, and if there are any more questions, please sign up.
Thank you. My name is Karsten Friis. I also work here at NUPI. So I just want to follow up, actually. You took part of my question. Can you just follow up then on you mentioned the Commission considered to, or is discussing how to fund defense cooperation. Can you elaborate a little bit about how that's, what are the discussions and how that fits into the PESCO? Thank you.
Well, on the last point, it's still unclear because the Commission has not been brought to the table in the details regarding PESCO to that effect. But as I said, I think it would make sense at some stage to have the Commission on board and be a partner in those discussions. What is already happening is a so-called preparatory action on defense research. There is already a budget until 2019-2020, and a number of projects are already being vetted to be funded. Then there is a bigger ambition that is after 2020 with the next multi-annual financial framework to have a European Defence Fund proper that would be run to that effect. And I don't want to enter too much into technicalities, but of course the main discussion is how far Commission funding could go. For those of you who are more familiar with these issues, there is so-called R&T phase of prototypes and things like that. And that is where already now there is agreement that the Commission can pitch in by contributing significantly to the cost, the initial cost of testing in particular. Then there is a second stage that is called already R&D, that has different stages in it. And at some stage, a prototype goes into production. The last stage is where the Commission cannot enter and will not enter, also for legal constraints. But there is a sort of grey area in between in which the Commission is considering to pitch in. And the legal basis for that is not defense, is competitiveness. interestingly. That is where Juncker has changed the picture, that the legal basis for that is no longer foreign policy or defense, is competitiveness. And it is why it is DG GROW, the former DG Enterprise, that is in charge of that. And the discussions now, and my understanding is that sooner or later a communication will be released by the Commission to this effect, is precisely how far they can go in co-funding. We published a little paper a couple of weeks ago, and we have an analyst who is very competent in this field, and he emphasized the fact that in every R&D process for the development of new, even dual-use equipment and technologies, there is a so-called valley of death, when the initial research risks being dispersed or lost because the amount of investment that are necessary to develop it further, to bring it to prototype level, is too high for the private sector, and very often the private sector pulls out. And that is where the Commission could make a difference. But there are some legal details that still have to be sorted out. But it is, yet again, it is a revolution. My last sentence in the slide was, it may be a small step for the world outside, but for the European Union, this is a giant leap, if I may paraphrase Neil Armstrong, because this is really something that until 2 years ago was not even conceivable inside the European Commission.
Indra?
Okay, I saved these questions because I'm not sure if you will consider them within the scope of this, this seminar, but two questions. One is the EU and China, two very big parts of the world which have a lot of trade together. Could they be moving, and not so many direct issues that they disagree about, I mean, that directly concern the interests of the two units where there are major potential for confrontation, although of course China is not a democracy, and that's an issue. But apart from that, it seems they have many things they agree about, including climate. So could there be closer relations somehow between those two units? And the other one is about Brexit. It seems to me that the EU kind of is forced to punish the UK for leaving, to set an example that it costs to leave. How hard does that punishment have to be before the pedagogical effect for internal purposes is sufficient?
I don't know if I can answer the second one, but the first one, well, as seen from the EU collective viewpoint, there is scope for intensifying relation with China as a vector of foreign direct investment, as a future market if China opens up its own domestic markets, and in terms of trade. Some countries in the EU are a little bit more cautious because they see China as a competitor, especially in sectors like textiles and so on and so forth. I suspect that a few years from now, even Germany may start being a little bit worried about China as an industrial competitor, but not yet. Germany still has a very, very good balance with China in that particular respect. And clearly China is a country that is predictable in international relations, that has a vested interest in preserving lanes of communication and global trade alive. That is why if the US moves into towards a more protective stance, protectionist stance, China could be an ally rather than an enemy in that particular respect. In some EU countries, there is increasing concern, however, about the areas in which Chinese direct investment is going domestically. Those countries that are, I don't know how to phrase this, more hungry for foreign direct investment tend to be less concerned about this. As you know, China invested heavily in Greece after the Eurozone crisis. The Piraeus port is basically owned by Chinese companies. Chinese investment in the Western Balkans and also in some EU member states, including my own, is quite massive in this respect. And therefore it is welcome because it is fresh money coming from outside in order to enhance productivity and trade. In other cases, there is a bit of concern that it could also go into strategic sectors, including the defense industry, incidentally. And I would not be surprised if at some stage one possible move would be also to start discussing at EU level protection mechanisms in this particular aspect. The One Belt, One Road initiative has been formally welcomed by most European countries because they see, yet again, the investment, the connectivity, the facilitation for world trade, and Asia is the economic engine of the 21st century and probably will dominate the world economy at the end of the 21st century. And therefore, everything that facilitates trade and investment with that area is welcome. At the same time, of course, as you may have noticed, China has developed also new frameworks in relations with European countries that tend to circumvent the European Union. The most famous one is the 16+1 framework that includes some EU members, in particular Central Europeans, and some non-EU members such as the Balkans, the Western Balkan countries. And China invites these 16 partners to the table and discusses also bilaterally with each one of them specific infrastructure projects. Now that is something that to some extent breaks EU solidarity and makes it more difficult to do what I just mentioned, that is to build up defenses against takeovers from Chinese companies. But that is something that's still at a very embryonic stage. I would say that tactically in the short term, nobody wants to irk China, although, for instance, in the crisis over the South China Sea, the European Union took a position of principle that was critical of the Chinese stance. But as you may remember, there were 2 member states that in the end made it impossible to adopt it as a decision by the 28. It had to be a declaration by the High Representative. And the 2 member states were Hungary and Greece. That happened a few months ago. On Brexit, as I said, first of all, I cannot really say much to that effect, in part because I don't know exactly, and in part because even if I did, I couldn't say too much to that effect. I think that we have to wait until after the UK elections. It is quite clear that Theresa May is asking for a solid mandate that would give her legitimacy to negotiate something with the European Union, and potentially, and hopefully for her, make her freer of the pressure of the Eurosceptic wing inside his party, which would give her, if she has a bigger majority, and not the 15 MPs she has now, she will be able to have a more flexible attitude in the negotiations. The impression in Brussels is that the negotiating position of the UK is unrealistic, that the expectations about what they can get out of the negotiations is too high, and at some stage will backfire domestically, which is incidentally one of the reasons perhaps why Theresa May has called the elections now and not in 2020 when they were foreseen initially at the end of the legislative period, to get rid of the vote, get a mandate, and then negotiate with a freer hand. So far there has been, it was highlighted earlier on, remarkable solidarity and unity among the 27 about the position to take there. And if I may summarize it in very rough terms, it is that the UK should not get out of the negotiations with a better deal than the one it has now, with a better deal than the one that Norway has. And at some stage, of course, some member states hope they will also benefit from the relocation of some banks from the City of London to the continent, from the relocation of some industrial activities, Japanese or else, to the continent, precisely in the event of high trade barriers in the future between the UK and the European Union. There are also some sensitive issues, and I think one of the issues that you may have followed that have come to the fore is Northern Ireland. It's very dear to the Republic of Ireland, and they made a lot of background work in order to articulate a position. I suppose that at some stage Gibraltar could also come into the picture. We tend to laugh, but it is not. It is something that could steer nationalist feelings in both Spain and the UK very, very easily. And therefore, my take is that a number of transitional arrangements will be necessary, because the whole thing cannot be sorted out in a few months, because that is the actual negotiating time that exists. Or else, the worst case scenario is no deal. When you open a negotiation, I mean, there is no obligation to have a deal at the end of this. The UK could pull out on the 31st of March 2019 without a deal. And that will be highly disruptive for both sides. My hunch is that it will be more disruptive for the UK than for the rest of the European Union, but that would be a lose-lose situation. And I think that the negotiators are aware that this is also a potential outcome, that there would be no deal. And that will probably keep the European Union busy for quite a while. Because all the things that we have discussed so far will happen in a context in which we expect the negotiations to be carried out with some reasonable attitude on both sides, that some compromise at some stage will be reached. But if there is no compromise, the effect could be disruptive. It's not about punishing. I think the European Union just wants to defend its own interest in this particular case. And as you can imagine, if the UK came out with the typical best of both worlds, that was also presented by the Eurosceptics in the referendum campaign, it would be terrible for everybody inside the European Union. First of all, of course, the temptation for other countries to pursue a similar deal, be it inside the European Union or in the vicinity, and also the fact that, of course, the project itself would lose credibility to some extent. So it's not that the EU wants to punish the UK, it wants just to defend itself, which I think is a legitimate goal in this particular respect.
I have one last question about the neighbourhood policy, because it has been claimed that with the global strategy, the neighbourhood policy as we knew it is more or less dead, or is changed. And we also have a revised neighbourhood policy. And especially this focus on principled pragmatism is not really in line with the neighbourhood policy, at least the integration dynamics. So I wonder what is your take on that?
Well, the review process that was carried out in 2015 basically kept the definition of ENP, European Neighbourhood Policy, but emptied it of all its original meaning. You remember the European Neighbourhood Policy was sort of single template for all the neighbors. Then we can adapt the different policy priorities to each and every neighbor of this sub-region, but of course it is the same for all, and it is they want to become like us. That was the assumption, and therefore we will allow them to become like us. Now, 10 years afterwards, we know that they don't necessarily want to become like us. Some of them want to live like us, but that is a different story. It's not exactly the same. And therefore, a degree of adaptation has to be made. 4 or 5 years into the process, the ENP split to some extent into, you remember, the Union for the Mediterranean and the Eastern Partnership again. So the two original sources were yet again somewhat separated also within the different institutional frameworks for dialogue with the neighbors that existed. Now, if you look at the southern aspect of that, the Union for the Mediterranean is an international institution based in Barcelona, but I challenge you to tell me what they do. Nothing, basically. It is in a secluded area on the Montjuïc in Barcelona, heavily guarded, but I mean, in part internal disagreement, in particular the role of Israel and the extent to which Israel could be associated to activity. In part, the consequences of the Arab Spring. There are countries that don't have a government. They cannot really speak on behalf of the country. And of course, a sense of loss of direction for the whole process is there. If you remember when the Union for the Mediterranean was inaugurated on the 14th of July 2008 on the Champs-Élysées, sitting or standing on the lodge of the Champs-Élysées alongside Nicolas Sarkozy were Gaddafi, Mubarak, Ben Ali, and Assad. Okay, that was the Union for the Mediterranean. So that the credibility today is dented. And of course, the region as a whole is in turmoil. And for the Eastern Partnership, that was a sort of lower level of formalization and was promoted, you may remember, by Poland and Sweden in particular in 2008, Bildt and Sikorski at that time. Well, if you look at the Eastern Partnership today, and all the conversations among the ministers are about this, you have basically 3 countries that want to get closer to the European Union. It's Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and 3 countries that don't, and it is Belarus, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Now, the trouble is that the 3 countries who want to get closer to the European Union suffer from similar diseases. One is corruption, lower in Georgia, to be entirely honest. That is Saakashvili's legacy. But Moldova and Ukraine are heavily affected by deep-seated corruption, which makes it more difficult for the European Union also to help them. And perhaps most importantly, all 3 countries do not have full control over their sovereign territory. Donbass and Crimea for Ukraine, Transnistria for Moldova, Abkhazia and South Ossetia for Georgia. You have 3 countries that do not control their own national territories. And therefore, to some extent, when you want to preserve the EAP format with the 6 countries, it's very difficult to have anything in common between them. And for the European Union, it's also even more difficult to come up again with this idea of everything but institutions. You can become like us, but without becoming full members of the European Union. That is why the review of the ENP insists a lot on tailor-made solutions for each and every country, trying to work with each country on the issues that are most important for them, trying to fight corruption, to build better governance in all countries, but it's a long-term policy, and I'm not entirely sure that the resources that we are devoting to that are enough precisely to solve all these issues. If you like, it is a typical case in which the policy has changed, but the label has remained the same. It is still called European Neighbourhood Policy, although the global strategy doesn't talk about neighbourhood. I think that one time in the text, the term neighbourhood falls into that, but in reference to the ENP. Otherwise, the notion is neighbours. So the plurality, the diversity of the neighbours is emphasized a lot.
Thank you so much, Antonio. This was a very good seminar. Thank you for your presentation and for answering our questions. I would just inform you that we will have another Europe seminar, also with an Italian that you might know, Ferruccio Pastore, who will come here to talk about migration policy the 9th of June. So I welcome you back for that seminar. Thanks a lot.